With this lesson, we're going to begin a series of studies in the Old Testament, essentially a survey of the Old Testament, a broad look at it, and we're going to have to, of course, break it down because the Old Testament is filled with so much information. And we begin by looking at an overview of the Old Testament. We know that there are a total of 39 books in the Old Testament, beginning in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, down to Malachi chapter 4. We understand that it covers a time period of about 3,600 years, beginning in about 4000 BC. Now, how do we get this 4000 BC? If you take from us back to Jesus Christ, that's about 2,000 years. From Jesus Christ back to Abraham is 2,000 years. Now, that's true when you look at the Bible and count up the chronology of the Bible, but that's also acknowledged by historians and by people that are in the secular world. So there's no real dispute or argument about that time frame. So 2,000 from us to Jesus, from Jesus to Abraham about 2,000, then from Abraham back to Adam is about 2,000 years as well. Now, the Bible would verify all these things, and the chronologies, and you add up the dates and things like that, that's what you come out with. So 2,000 from us to Jesus, Jesus to Abraham about 2,000, Abraham back to Adam about 2,000. That's where we get 4,000 BC. Now, it ends around 400 BC. That is the 5th century, early 5th century BC, Malachi dating down to around the 430s BC or so. And you could give or take a little bit of time on all of these, a decade or two, a century or two. But this is essentially, biblically, what we're talking about for the time period of the Old Testament. Something else we want to look at is the 5 general categories that we can break the Old Testament down into. First of all, we have the law from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Then we have history from Joshua to Esther. Then we have wisdom from Job to Song of Solomon. We have the major prophets from Isaiah down to Daniel. Then the minor prophets from Hosea down to Malachi. And we want to break these down just a little bit further and explain about them. First, you have the law, of course, Genesis to Deuteronomy. This is the law of Moses. Now, it's not that Genesis is part of the law of Moses, but that's the way that it's grouped. The Jews took the Old Testament, they did not break it down chronologically, they broke it down by subject, and that's how they compiled it and put it together. And so we have law, and it's lumped together as law, Genesis to Deuteronomy. We have history, the history of the Jewish nation, the people of God taking them into the land of Canaan, of either their faithfulness or their unfaithfulness in that land, and continued unfaithfulness and rebellion to God. And so God took them off into captivity, and then it tells us about them being restored and brought back into the land of Israel. So you have the history of the Jewish people. Then you have the wisdom literature from Job to Song of Solomon. And the wisdom literature essentially deals with practical, everyday questions and problems of life. You have Job covering the idea of why do good people suffer. Well, sometimes we just don't always understand the workings of the world, but understand that we need to trust in God no matter what happens. The devil's trying to attack us to get us to turn our back on God, but if we remain faithful, God will bless us. You have the Psalms, and David essentially in there, and there are others as well who wrote Psalms, but expressing their fear, anxiety, praise, trust, love, guilt, shame before God, and their dealings with God and with fellow man before God. You have Proverbs talking about practical everyday insights of daily life, of the way to live and the way that will lead you to a happy life and what wisdom is in this world, fearing God. And then the Song of Solomon dealing with the issue of true love. What is true love between a man and a woman? Then finally the major prophets, the minor prophets, and it's not that the Isaiah was greater or a better man than Malachi. It just has to do with the scope and really the volume of their work. But the major and minor prophets have one message in them, and that is to repent. Now, Jesus looked at this just a little bit differently. In Luke 24, verse 44, He broke down the Old Testament into the law, the Psalms, and the prophets. As He's talking to His disciples there and explaining to Him about His death, burial, and resurrection, He says that He was to talk to them or reveal to them all things concerning Him in the law, the Psalms, and the prophets. Now, one thing else we want to cover, and that is the theme of the Old Testament. going to be very difficult, so hang on there just 1 second. Here we are, the coming king and kingdom. That's the theme of the Old Testament. You could break that down into many different things. You could look at different aspects of it, but that's essentially what the Old Testament is all about, the coming of the king and his kingdom. Well, that completes our first video and first lesson on the Old Testament survey, just looking at a broad overview. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you join us again for more lessons in the Old Testament.